We've been saying right since even before the first meeting started this morning that we do need to talk about policing. It's very much in the news these days, often with negative connotations and more. And we're very lucky to have Beatrice Jauregui to speak to us on that topic. Beatrice is both an anthropologist and a criminologist who has published widely and deeply on these topics. And I know from having looked at a curriculum document of hers that she also challenges and stimulates her students to think deeply about things that they may have taken for granted or have their own stereotypes about beforehand. So now it's our turn to join her in that kind of thinking. Thank you, Beatrice, and it's all yours. Unmute yourself, of course.
Okay, can everyone hear me? I think I unmuted. Okay, great. Thank you, Margaret. And thank you, everyone, to all the organizers. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. What I've gotten to listen to so far this morning has been really, really wonderful and excellent. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. So first I thought I'd tell you just a bit, a background about my work. My first monograph was essentially an ethnography of the everyday life and work of police officers in northern India, where I've been doing field work since about 2004 was really when I first went to Uttar Pradesh, or UP, which is India's most populous state. It's about 200 million people. The demographics, people often note that if it was a sovereign state, it would be the 6th largest country in the world. So highly populous state. And I've been coming and going for almost 20 years now, but did the major part of my field work for the monograph in 2006 and 2007. Where I was really interested in, the police kind of understandings of themselves and how this manifested in their everyday work. And while I was there also, I became very interested in thinking about, representations of police as cultural figures, which is very central to much of what I've published. And really thinking about what's basically a reduction of policing to essentially violence, right? Or in, kind of more Weberian terms, this idea that policing represents this, as I'm sure most of you have read or heard in some capacity, its idealized monopoly of the state on legal and legitimate coercion by violence. So it's not just a popular understanding that policing equals violence, but also what arose really in the mid-20th century as police studies scholarship also has centered violence as the raison d'etre of policing. For example, the sociologist Egon Bittner, he's kind of known as one of the fathers of policing studies, essentially defined policing as the quote, mechanism for the distribution of non-negotiably coercive force employed in accordance with the dictates of an intuitive grasp of the situational exigencies, or, put, I guess, another way, that in sum, the role of police is to address any kind of human problem when and insofar as the solution to that problem may require the use of force at the point of occurrence. So this centering of the violence of police work is in many ways, I think, the beating heart of what I think we're all now familiar with as this globalized call to defund the police or even abolish the police following the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement in the wake of the murder of George Floyd last year by former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, whom, as I'm sure you know, is on trial as we speak for this murder. So these calls to defund, and there are other words, detask, demilitarize, even dismantle police, they reflect, and in many ways revitalize, long-standing debates over whether and how to reform police institutions the world over. And of course, these debates are quite heated, polarizing. They often revert to and rely on, I think, kind of us versus them structure of relations, the police versus the public, or the police versus the policed. And people often feel compelled, right, to choose between something as radical as, say, abolition of police on the one hand, or actively supporting police actors and institutions in their calls to recognize that, quote, blue lives matter, right? And that most police are good apples, but there are a few rotten apples. That's the defense often. Now, among the key figures at the center of these discursive and policy culture wars are police unions. And their framing, of course, is polarized as well for police and their own associates. Unions are professional associations. They're often not actually certified trade unions, but of course they represent a necessary force for the protection of their rights as employees, as public sector employees with unique job-related risks and responsibilities. But on the other hand, for abolitionists and others who are interested in dismantling police institutions, these unions represent, conservative lobbyists, obstructionists, and generally forces that reproduce structural violence, right, by defending actors who routinely abuse their power and also do things like forge collective agreements that allow the continuation of such abuse as essential to what some scholars have termed violence work, which is the title of this. So it's not surprisingly, there's long been widespread skepticism about including police unions in organized labor more generally. Police labor is considered categorically different from most other forms of work because it potentially may involve the deployment of violence in the name of security and order. And perhaps this is also why police unions remain a surprisingly understudied and under-theorized topic of social theory the world over, and even in sites that dominate in police studies scholarship like the US. Now, historical accounts of either police unions or police strike actions, they've tended to, describe these things as kind of singular or highly localized events. So not really thinking about them in tandem, or as a kind of global phenomenon, but, just looking at a particular place and time. And there are a few sociological accounts in countries like the UK, Australia, New Zealand, that have proposed things like police union typologies, or explained police strikes and protests as like stress reactions or some kind of response to political economic conditions. But on the whole, it's not really thought of as a kind of global phenomenon, which is what I'm trying to do in my own research. Now, what little scholarship does exist on these matters of police strikes and police unions, of course, also tends to focus on regions in the global north and their conditions, which really don't address so much of what are the conditions of life and structures of relations in the global south, where I work. So for example, in northern India, police unions have actually been mostly illegal since 1966, when the National Parliament instituted what's actually known as the Police Restriction of Rights Act. It's a national statute, although it hasn't been ratified by all the states in India, which is a federation. And in Brazil, where I've more recently started doing research, police unions have historically been legal and often widely supported by many members of the public. Although just a few years ago in 2017, a Supreme Court of Brazil decision came down that's begun to delegitimize police unions and what I refer to more broadly as police worker politics, since I do want to highlight the fact that unions, not only are they sometimes banned or do they not exist, but they're not even necessarily always the end goal or even the means of police labor actions. So in the time I have remaining, what I'd like to do is just briefly kind of compare and contrast some of the distinctive features of police worker politics in Brazil and India mainly, but then also think about how they can apply here in North America. And I really want to think about the implications of the differences in these contexts for public debates around institutional transformation and indeed reckoning with, systemic inequality and the kinds of things that the defund the police movement is calling for. Because I think it's really important to understand that police unions and unionists can work both for and against social justice movements, depending on the context. So I first want to spend just a couple of minutes considering this idea of policing as violence work, which it's an idea that's been gaining prominence, especially in the last few years since the publication of a book in 2016 by historian Michael Siegel. She defines police personnel as violence workers, insofar as their use of physical force realizes what she terms the core power, the core of the power of the state. And so she invokes this like centuries spanning, roll call of social and political theorists from Marx and Weber, actually going back first to Machiavelli and Hobbes, but then through to, Michel Foucault and the aforementioned Egon Bittner, the sociologist I quoted earlier. And Siegel explains that her labeling of police as violence workers is not intended to indict them as bad people, but, quote, simply about what their labor rests upon and therefore conveys into the material world. And she further notes that she deploys this term violence work specifically to highlight the idea of work or labor itself, and actually, kind of crossing it with the insights of movements like the sex work movement, for example, where people, very much prefer that term to prostitution to correct the denial of that activity as labor. So while I find it problematic that this term, I think, again, really reduces or essentializes policing labor as always already violence, I do want to recognize, and appreciate this, this attention to thinking about policing as work or as labor, qua labor. But I think definitely, certainly something that's been revealed in my own work and also by another of anthropologists who've studied policing, reducing policing to violence work, certainly, I think it really occludes as much as it reveals, because in many ways it conflates the ends of policing as a social practice with one of the means of policing. That is, again, the potential to use physical force when deemed necessary. Though in fact, most of the time, police work does not actually involve physical force or coercion. As I'm sure we know, police provide all kinds of resources, direction, instruction, peacekeeping, information sharing and gathering, negotiation and de-escalation. So there are a host of, capabilities that they have and work that they're asked to do in association with order maintenance. And of course, we can't deny that there are very real and often reasonable demands for, the various kinds of labor that police perform in the name, again, of realizing security, right? Whatever that might mean and whomever it may serve or harm in a specific time space. And, obviously we have to deal with inequality here, and that makes all the difference sometimes. So what I propose is, instead of thinking about policing as violence work, even though certainly sometimes violence is one of the tools in the toolbox, thinking it a bit more as, what I call security labor, or something that will always be in demand. And I think what we really need to try to do is understand the complex tensions that abide between demands for security and demands for social justice. We often, they aren't, if you think about it, necessarily in opposition. They can be working in parallel, right? So there are convergences and divergences in the meaning of security in a broad sense, like human security and social justice. And these are really, I think, at the heart of the current debates around defunding police. Of course, as I've already alluded to, we have to acknowledge that demands for security and for police work as security labor certainly arise in contexts of longstanding inequality, structured by differences in race and ethnicity, gender and sexuality, socioeconomic class, religion, citizenship, et cetera, et cetera. And police work does reflect and exacerbate these broader social problems, right? So it's not that policing is the origin, of course, of these problems, but it definitely reproduces them socially. And we also have to note, I think, that people from many marginalized communities suffer not just from over-policing, but also under-policing, right? Or this feeling of being neglected when they do need help. And this is part of why, many people in minority communities actually will call for or express demands for more policing at the same time that we see, these, ACAB and all these calls for abolition and such too. So again, this is going to drastically vary by context. So what I'd like to turn to now is some of the cultural and historical specificities of how police work as security labor often gets not only conceptualized, but also practiced. And I use this term, or I take and kind of build on this term, security labor, which was actually used by another historian. His name is Partha Pratim Shil, and he's, I think, now just started at Stanford as a professor there. And so he analyzed patterns of recruitment and everyday police work among constables in South Asia, basically over the period from 1850 to 1950. So it was during this period that constables expressed their job-related grievances through a variety of techniques, but the one that he really focuses on is what's called the strike threat. So this relied on, kind of the power of rumors. They would circulate pamphlets and have meetings. And because, there's a lot of administrative anxiety among the colonial administration about, especially after, this major rebellion of soldiers in 1857, a lot of anxiety around the indigenous people who had been recruited to be the vast majority of the police force at that time. So there were these strike threats, and actually this is a technique that is still very much in play in India today. As recently as 2016, constables in the southern state of Karnataka actually threatened to strike under the leadership of a unionist there named Shashidhar Venugopal. He's actually been trying to establish a union in Karnataka since 1986, but because of this parliamentary act from 1966, as you can imagine, there are a lot of legal obstructions to founding a union. Anyway, and so he, under his leadership, there were, thousands of police threatened to call out of work. Venugopal himself was actually arrested and charged with sedition and eventually released. But actually, importantly, in response to this threat, this strike threat, the state government of Karnataka did actually, they formed a committee of inquiry and they ended up recommending, I think, an almost 50% pay increase for constables there, which took effect in August of 2019. Now, so this was kind of a success story in a way. They don't have a union. They didn't even have a strike, but they were able to get some concessions, though this is certainly not always the case. Other would-be police unions in India, including those in the region where I work, which is in the north, Karnataka's in the south, they have not been so successful. And in fact, following decades of advocacy, a number of groups in this state of Uttar Pradesh, they're still, they're legally banned. And actually, two of the unionist leaders that I've been working with for about the past 5 years, kind of shadowing them when I am in the field and just kind of keeping up with their activities, of course, interviewing them. They were actually detained for an entire year between 2018 to 2019 for basically instigating a protest among police in this state. They were detained actually without charge under the 1980 National Security Act, and also a still active 1922 Incitement to Disaffection Act. So this is a colonial era act. And in any case, to date, no legal or political advocacy in this state has succeeded in allowing the formation of a union, to say nothing of making headway on a host of demands that many of these constables have, just related to pay, benefits, shift work. There's still actually no concept of shift work there today. Police are essentially on duty 24/7. And there's also there's a way in which systemically the constables, the lowest kind of rank and file police, are routinely exploited by senior officers for things like domestic labor, even other kinds of non-mandated police labor like construction and digging ponds and all sorts of things. So I can talk more about this if people are interested in the Q&A. But these are some images from protests and sit-ins by serving or dismissed constables who've been trying to form unions unsuccessfully. And a lot of, people say that a lot of the resistance, or some say oppression by the state government to police unionism in this context actually is related to some violent uprisings that did occur in the past, including an especially lethal revolt or uprising of constables in this state of Uttar Pradesh in 1973, where scores of police officers and military soldiers died in clashes. And many police constables were detained, again, for things like sedition and being, a national security threat. And this uprising itself, this is something I found in the police archives in Lucknow. It's actually they've actually been calling for a kind of memorial. Like they termed many of the police who died in this uprising, kind of martyrs, shaheed. And even in this kind of, cartoonish representation, which was essentially trying to call people together, I think 6 years later, to memorialize this uprising of police. But you can see they have these bloody swords. And in the Hindi, I don't know if anyone here can read Hindi, but they basically list the different sites of this police uprising, which occurred at about a dozen different places across the state. And this uprising was, the instigation of it was essentially blamed on an organization called the Rajya Police Karmachari Parishad, or the State Police Workers Union. This was a group that had been trying to form since the late 1960s. And this is actually, I found this in the archives as well. This is a copy of their logo, which is kind of, have kind of a revolutionary fist holding what's called a shanka, which is a shell, a conch shell, which is often actually blown at religious ceremonies and is a symbol, kind of a war trumpet, like calling the gods. So this RPKP is the acronym. There are still police unionists today that are trying to revive or really continue this group. They've been working underground for 50 years now, and are still trying to overturn. They're trying to call the ban on unions unconstitutional. There's all kinds of litigation. But anyway, this is just one example of the kind of groundswell that's come up in this context, in this post-colonial context. And there have been a number of strikes in India, including a rash across different states. This one was just in one state, but in 1979, there was a police strike that spread to over a dozen states in India. A similar thing actually happened in Brazil about 20 years later in 1997, where there was a wave of strikes, again, across more than a dozen Brazilian states. And they were spurred by, very kind of routine labor demands, increased wages, et cetera. At that time, Brazilian constables were only making about $286 a month for rank and file, police, which was senior officers made, I think, 15 times that. So a lot of this too is kind of a class warfare where there's a senior elite that is doing okay with the system as it is, but the vast majority of subalterns are very dissatisfied with things. So in Brazil, kind of turning there now, there have been a number of strikes, even since 1997, and even just in the last 4 years, there have been 2 major strikes, one in Espírito Santo in 2017, and another in the state of Ceará, that's what's pictured here, just last year in 2020. Now, one thing I wanted to note about the Brazilian case is that not just in 1997, but I think in various instances, we can see there's a kind of a real prevalent public support, which I think goes along with just a broader history of social labor movements in this context. In the 1997 case in Brazil that I just mentioned, that was, again, across many states, there was, just all kinds of people saying, we support the police. And this is very different from how it was in India, where there was some evidence of support by like opposition politicians and such. But for the most part, it didn't seem as prevalent or widespread, or certainly as passionate as it was in Brazil. So one of the big questions in my research program, kind of comparing these situations, is what generates such emphatic public support for protesting police or for any kind of police worker politics in one time space, but either tacit or routinized or even quite vehement opposition in other contexts. I think one possible explanation for the difference here might stem from, we're back in 1997 again, in at least one of the states, like the state where this Brazilian police strike started, Minas Gerais, the police were actually, apparently pretty regarded as pretty progressive, kind of citizen-oriented, leftist. So that's one thing to consider, how police are understood and aligned with broader, political ideologies and parties and such. And this relates actually to, I think, a really fascinating thing that's emerged just in the past few years in Brazil, which is an organization that I think many might consider kind of paradoxically progressive, called the Polícia Antifascismo, or anti-fascist police, which it's been receiving significant public attention over the past few years. This picture is the logo from their Facebook page. And so this group, their platform includes, in many ways, what could be termed classic labor or police worker politics issues, professional advancement, promotion, salaries, et cetera. But I think what's interesting about it is how it also manifests this much broader, and again, I think kind of counterintuitive ideology calling for the demilitarization of policing and of public security more broadly in this context. So, as you may know, Brazilian policing is notoriously associated with violence, especially in association with, racial inequality. There's still ongoing war on drugs in the region more broadly. It has an infamously high number of homicides by police. I think in 2019, it was over 1,800 people killed by police just in that 1 year in Brazil. So this movement, this anti-fascist police movement in Brazil, it's still very new and emerging. And actually a collaborator at the in Sao Paulo, and we're starting to conduct interviews with the founders and members of this movement. But it's very interesting. It's reportedly garnered endorsements from police in at least 10 states in Brazil, and seems to be gathering a lot of public support as well. So just something to watch out for. And I think another important feature of police unionism or police worker politics in Brazil is that family members are often very centrally involved as well. So it's not just the police themselves going on strike or forming unions, but especially in the last few years, the last few strikes that have happened in various Brazilian states, that family members and relatives and close associates of the police have been very prominent in picketing. For example, blockade. This is an image from Vitoria when the family members of police essentially blockaded a station and wouldn't let the police out to do their job. So this is something to think about too, is of course how these official organizations are integrated with more kind of informal associations. And I don't want to give the impression that that everyone in Brazil is publicly supporting these unions, but and often they are. If there's a strike, it is deemed a public crisis, but it's just, again, a very interesting difference. So I think I'm almost my little over time or out of time. I can't see the chat.
You have 3 or 4 more minutes.
3 or 4? Okay, great. So thinking about, again, this is kind of going back to the Supreme Court decision in Brazil, where it's becoming increasingly hard for police there to think about to do strikes or to do unions. There's this, you could say, a kind of delegitimization perhaps going on globally that I think reflects, something more global, in terms of inequality, not only within these regions, but global North and global South inequalities. And this is why in approaching these kinds of questions, I think we need to, remember that policing itself is a global form. It's something that's, emerged through processes of colonization, decolonization, democratization, and it manifests, institutional similarities in many places, but also, there are vast differences. So, again, like in India and Brazil, many of the rank and file live in squalor. They're exploited by their senior officers and others, while their counterparts here in Canada and the US and other places, most of whom are well-paid members of robust unions or professional associations, they couldn't imagine this kind of thing. And so, we have now, just as of 2019, you probably know, the RCMP finally voted to unionize here. So this is still itself very much a developing story, a kind of emergent, what are the main issues going to be for them, and how are they going to fit in with these broader conversations and debates around defunding, detasking, et cetera. So the other thing I just wanted to briefly mention before finishing, it's even here in North America, again, because of the way police arose, some of the conditions that give rise to these, uprisings or unionist movements in global South countries were also, they also existed here. The RCMP predecessor, the Northwest Mounted Police, there were some strikes in I think between 1886 and 1889. Also, down across the border in Boston, and also here in Toronto, even in the early 1900s, there were also these uprisings. So looking at the history of how police workers were themselves kind of in opposition to organized labor, but at the same time also, calling for their own rights. It's something I think we just have to think about in a global context, because you can see police organizing all over, from Argentina, Nigeria, South Africa, and with varying degrees of success. And sometimes they're even communicating transnationally with each other There are some international associations, but again, often they're kind of fragmented. So I just think as we, consider these global calls for defunding and also consider the role of police unions, which may indeed in some cases be obstructionist to necessary reforms, there are also ways in which, we need to acknowledge that they're not always that way. And there may be a real need for these kinds of organizations, depending on the context. But such a nuanced understanding, is often blunted, I think, or elided by this popular and also scholarly reduction of policing to violence work writ large. So I'll go ahead and end there and look forward to your questions and comments. Thanks.